All right, welcome in, folks. Welcome to the webinar today. So today we're going to be talking about LSD microdosing for mood and mental health, a conversation with New Zealand's pioneering psychedelic researchers. I am joined by Dr. Suresh Muthukumaraswamy and Dr. Rachael Sumner, researchers at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, who are leading the world's first government-sanctioned clinical trials of LSD microdosing for mood disorders. And I'm also joined by Steph Karzon Abrams. Steph, what do you go by? I just know
that is my name, Paul. That is my name.
We're also joined by Steph. So Steph and I are going to be sort of co-facilitating and co-leading this conversation today about LSD microdosing. As you're coming in, I would invite you to just drop a hello in the chat. Tell us where you're calling in from. Kimberly has so graciously led us in that direction. She's calling in from Michigan. Hi, Chelsea. Welcome in, folks. So we'll kick off officially at about 5 past the hour, just to give folks plenty of time to start to drop in. But so before we do that, Steph, I'm curious, what are you most excited about for today's conversation with Suresh and Rachael?
I'm excited to dive into their research around women's health. Actually, that's a topic that I've been interested and advocating for quite some time, and was really excited to find out about their research. So diving into that will be really great.
And what interests you about that research in particular, Steph?
Mostly that we're experiencing this shift overall when it comes to how we view women's health. I think traditionally, the history has been that women's health is regarded as a version of men's health, and we haven't really particularly studied women specifically. We're really trying to understand how our biochemistry is different, how we need different treatment options. There are a lot of conventional therapies that have failed women through different hormonal transitions. Our hormones change throughout our lives, but we also experience difficult transitions that affect our quality of life, our mood, and more. And so seeing this investigation of psychedelic and plant medicines to fill that gap is really exciting. The newfound research looking at serotonin and estrogen and their relationship is really fascinating. And so hopefully we'll clarify a little bit of that and what exactly is being researched with LSD and what the opportunity is.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to a little bit is birth, right? So there's been some interesting research that's been started to be done on microdosing even for postpartum depression, much of it anecdotal, but I think there will be more.
Reunion has a study though, psilocybin for postpartum, which is good.
And then also menopause. And there's been some research that's also been starting to go on around microdosing and psychedelics for perimenopausal symptoms as well.
PMDD is a difficult, more challenging and severe form of PMS. And I think this is particularly an area of research for Suresh and Rachael. So that'll be really interesting. And although we won't be talking about ketamine today, in practice, since ketamine as a therapy is available here in the United States, many practitioners are starting to investigate how to apply ketamine-assisted therapy for some of these transitions. There was some research on postpartum in ketamine that's really promising. So I look forward to seeing what we do in clinical practice as well.
Great. So we have quite a few folks who have come in now. Folks, just so you know, we'll have time for quite a bit of Q&A towards the end. And as we're navigating this conversation today, feel free to drop questions in the chat. We'll make sure that we put that over in the Q&A section. So we can offer some of these questions up to Suresh and Rachael. So I'll hand it over to Suresh and Rachael. And Rachael, we'll start with you. And then we'll go to Suresh. So just would love a little bit of an introduction on your work, who you are, and why you have been working on this clinical trial for LSD microdosing.
Thank you. So yes, I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Auckland School of Pharmacy. I actually come from a cognitive neuroscience background, and I got into this field very much via Suresh. He was my PhD supervisor, and we were investigating ketamine as a potential antidepressant. But of course, Suresh had come from those studies at Imperial College London, those initial neuroimaging studies. So it was always on the pathway that he would begin to investigate psychedelics. And as somebody who's very geeky about neuroplasticity and novel treatment options and mechanism-informed treatment options, that's where I got swept up and interested in psychedelics as potential treatments. And I finished my PhD in 2019 at the conclusion of actually a menstrual cycle in the brain study and a ketamine in the brain study, headed straight into a scopolamine and depression study, and then into the microdosing research that people are most familiar with. I've always been involved in the blood biomarkers, the EEG markers of treatment response. And so I'm currently involved in the depression and microdosing research. And I mentioned my PhD work in women's health because while I've also grown a distinct research program away from psychedelics and involved in the menstrual cycle, those are coming back together with what Stephanie mentioned, which is the premenstrual dysphoric disorder and the potential match between women's health and psychedelics as novel treatment options. So that's me.
Beautiful. And we're going to come back to Rachel. We'll be pinging between Rachel, Suresh, Steph throughout this conversation. But to hand it over to Suresh now. Suresh, we did a podcast in person together a few years ago, which I would encourage folks to check out. I think it's around podcast 190, where we went pretty deep into LSD microdosing. But for those folks who are here who don't know you, tell us a little bit about who you are and particularly why you're interested in this LSD microdosing research.
Yeah, I'm a professor of psychopharmacology at the University of Auckland. So I've been doing general psychopharmacology research for a long time. So before I started doing work with psychedelics, I was doing a lot of work with anesthetics and sedatives and anti-epileptics. And then around the mid-2010s, I started doing work with the Imperial Group around LSD and psilocybin, early imaging work around that. And then Then when I was back in New Zealand, I sort of started doing kind of ketamine work, and then was like, okay, let's start doing some psychedelic work, and was like kind of looking around at what was being done at the time and what wasn't being done. And LSD microdosing was something that people were doing a lot in the community, but there really wasn't any research on it in terms of clinical trials. So that's where I decided to kind of focus a bit of effort in and thought that we could add something that lots of other teams just weren't doing. And then we fell into a kind of unique situation where we were able to do trials that maybe other groups wouldn't be able to do. So, and we've been following it up since then.
So let's go into that a little bit. Talk to us a little bit about the unique trial design that you've been able to carry out in New Zealand with LSD microdoses. Why this trial design you think is so essential to better understanding the actual efficacy of microdosing and some of the early results that you started to notice. And Rachel, feel free to sort of ping on after with anything that Suresh may have missed.
Maybe how about I do the kind of background and Rachel can do the results, because otherwise I'll run out of steam. So Perfect. Yeah, so obviously most people know that LSD and psilocybin, they're illegal in most contexts, right? And so and the regulators generally wouldn't allow you to essentially, if you think about what a person who's like lifestyle microdosing or self-treating, whatever, right? They're doing it at home in their environment, and they, can take it and then do particular activities or, and live their life, right? So people microdose while they're living life. But the problem is when you want to study it in a clinical context is the regulators force you to give the microdoses or whatever in the laboratory, right? And in our labs, they're pretty boring places, right? They're just like white walls, very clinical kind of places, So it's not a very good representation of what actually microdosing is doing in reality. And that's what we really want to test, right, and study. So what I discovered is that in New Zealand, the legislation act, unlike in the US and most other jurisdictions, in New Zealand, the legislation actually allows you to prescribe Class A, what we call Class A or Schedule 1, depending on your jurisdiction. It allows you to prescribe those substances for people to take home. Although it was written in the law, but it had never actually been done before. But I think it was kind of like, so it was essentially like a loophole, and I sort of found that loophole, and then I just drove my tractor straight through it, much to the displeasure, I think, of the regulators and ethics committee, who were skeptical that it was legal, but it was. And after a lot of back and forth and effort, we drove it through and we got permission to run these trials with microdosing, where we could prescribe the microdoses for people to take home with them. So they could take, I think 5 at a time home with them, so that they could essentially administer it in their home environment and then go about their day like microdoses do. And then I think the design for the first trial was like 6 weeks of microdoses that people could do. So that I'm not aware of any other countries or places that have actually been able to recreate that kind of home microdosing platform that we've been able to do here. And so we've followed up with a number of studies. So that's kind of the platform that we're working off that allows us to do what we think are pretty ecologically valid studies of LSD microdosing. That other microdosing studies you see, those are actually lab-based studies, where ours are out in the wild.
Which is fantastic, right? These naturalistic settings, it's how people are actually microdosing in the real world. And honestly, now that you mention it, I'm kind of surprised that other folks haven't done some of the clinical trials or clinical research in New Zealand, right? There's one going on in Australia, I believe, or maybe a few now going on in Australia. There may be one in Canada that was just announced about microdosing psilocybin for anxiety. I saw an announcement about that the other day. So it's interesting, though, that this is the only one so far that we really know about.
Yeah, I think it's probably because New Zealand's a small country, so there's only so much capacity for doing things. Yeah.
Right. They say there's more sheep than people in New Zealand. Is that true?
True.
It is. Fact.
Rachael, so you've done you've had this incredible sort of naturalistic trial design that you've been able to bring forth. What were some of the results that came out of this LSD microdosing trial? And give us a sense as well of how often are people taking this microdose? How much is the microdose? At what time, point in time are they taking it in the morning, in the afternoon? So kind of bring us deep into the actual practical aspects of this and what results have come out of the research.
So, of course, Suresh, please do jump in if I get some of the facts wrong, because I'm involved in about 5 different studies. So if I accidentally cross them over, let me know. But anyway, no. And the first thing that I wanted to bubble out with, basically, with what Suresh was saying, is that it was, and it's going to seem really obvious to our audience, but that naturalistic setting really worked. So, it was really important. I think you can see our first study where you see the effect of the drug on the day that people were in the lab, and it's completely muted. And that's going to be driven by lots of things. We're running lots of tests, and all of the questionnaires that you run are things like, how did the drug affect X dimension of your feeling compared to usual? And there's nothing about the environment or your day or the tasks that you're doing that are usual. So how are you supposed to reference that? And so the first thing that is really obvious was how important it was to assess people's feelings of creativity and energy and wellness and all those sorts of things in their usual context, so that they could really anchor their sense of usual and difference from usual. The first study started off with the Fadiman protocol because that seemed like the best place to start. And so that one Suresh, 8 micrograms or 10 micrograms?
10 micrograms.
10 micrograms, thank you. Because the next study was 8. That's right. We started lower and they could titrate around that. So that first study was 10, and you did the Fadiman protocol where you dosed every 3 days. Because that just seemed the best place to start. And the things that we learned were that people need to be able to dose flexibly because of how it affects them. So there's this kind of, I think, the sense of ownership that comes through of microdosing that is a bit different to a classic prescription medicine, is that you take it when it suits you to take it. So that might be on a weekend day or on a day where you don't have responsibility, but roughly every 3 days. People were able to titrate what their dose was. So we started lower for the study where the top line results are just out now, LSD dip, and people, based on how they felt and whether they felt like that was enough or whether they wanted less, they were able to titrate that. And we've got a paper coming out soon, I think, that actually shows that there's a relationship between how people titrate. It's very low numbers, but there does seem to be a bit of a relationship between how people titrate their doses and how high their initial blood concentrations of the drug were. So people's flexibility with dosing actually seems to make sense from the data as well. So flexible dosing has been a big part of what we've allowed people to do. I've got off track. What next?
All right, let me just to clarify. So the first big study was a fixed dose of 10 micrograms.
Yes.
And that was in our healthy volunteers, and they were dosed every third day. But what we observed in a few of the participants that actually even 10 micrograms was too much for them.
Yes.
And then so we had to down titrate them in that study, and then so we found all these results in that healthy population. And then the second study, that's when we started doing titration for everybody, where we changed our formulation around, and then we let them start at 8 micrograms and work up all the way to 20. But most of them on average would end up at about 15 was what we determined was the average kind of microdose that people end up. Now that second trial was a trial in depressed patients to actually look for that antidepressant response.
And it was 15 micrograms was the average amount that folks were taking to have a clinically established antidepressant response. Am I understanding?
Yeah, that was what they were titrating to tolerance or to tolerability, right? Okay. So to the effect that they felt comfortable with, So, and if they went too high to 17, they go, oh, that was maybe a little bit too much, and then they would drop back down, which is kind of what people do out in the wild, right?
Right. Yeah, we call it calibration in some of the classes that I teach, right? How do we calibrate the dose level appropriately so we can it's still quote unquote sub-intoxicating or sub-perceptual or whatever that is, because it's got to be a hard part of this trial as well, like almost coaching people or supporting people in understanding what is a real microdose here,
Yeah.
Yeah, so we define it as being kind of right on that edge of perception. It's like you kind of like are feeling it, but it's, if it is disturbing your day, then it's too much.
Right.
If it's like actively like impairing you in some way, then that's too much and you've got to go down. But if you don't feel anything at all, then you probably want to go up. It's kind of where we've kind of tried to get people to calibrate to.
So let's talk about that a little bit in terms of how we define microdosing. We hear a lot about this sub-perceptual dose. What you are inferring to is not so much sub-perceptual. We are perceiving it, but it's not disturbing, derailing your day. It's sub-hallucinogenic. Can you speak a little bit to this like dosing and clinical benefit? Where is that threshold where that dose might be sub-perceptual or too low, and it's not translating into an actual clinical effect that you can actually measure, versus maybe taking a little bit more, perceiving it, still being okay to do your day? Does that really, influence what you can measure and what the clinical benefit is?
I don't know that we have enough data yet, but the first thing that I want to kind of jump into is what the initial thing showed, is that if you, from a pharmacology point of view, right, is if you're not feeling anything, there's every possibility that by the time it's making into your bloodstream, you've got less of it than if you had taken more, and therefore it's going to have less of an effect. And there are lots of reasons why you can take the same dose of something as somebody else and have less of it in your blood than somebody else would have. And that's because we take it orally, and it has to pass through and get metabolized by different organs. And even sublingually, it still gets and goes through different organs and then gets cleared out. So there are lots of reasons why you might take the same dose as your friend. And it's not that you're stronger and can tolerate it better. It's actually that you've got less of it in your blood by the time you're trying to assess the effect. And then the answer is, well, yes, that is, if there is a concentration that is required in your blood to be therapeutically useful, then you're going to be below that, and it's not going to be useful. But there's another level of complexity, is we don't actually know the relationship between how you feel and the clinical effect.
Right.
But we do know that when people feel If they feel sparkly and close to other people, they're going to be fine with that. It's perceptible, but they're going to be okay with that. The problems come in when people go, I feel irritable. I can't focus. I can't work. I'm having to take the day off work because it's a microdosing day today. And the thing is people will then stop the treatment. And this is what you see with SSRIs. It doesn't matter if the dose they were on was the therapeutic dose, because they will stop the treatment anyway. And then no treatment is definitely not effective. So it's a complex relationship. And we don't have all the answers.
Thanks for calling that out. And I think something that is of interest is when we talk about microdosing, I feel like people associate psilocybin to microdosing, right? Here we're talking about LSD. So let's do a little comparison analysis between the two. A lot of the microdosing research on psilocybin thus far hasn't been great. There's a lot of microdosing research that says that, the microdose is not superior to a placebo effect. What are we seeing with LSD? It seems like the microdosing research or the low dose LSD research, however, is a little bit more positive. What can we attribute that to? Is it the neuropharmacological mechanism? Is it because it's longer lasting? What can you say about that?
I'm going to jump in and say it's about the research groups doing it.
Okay, nice.
and the methods being used, like there's only like half dozen research groups around the world doing any kind of microdosing research. And it just happens that like the 3 or 4 groups, like our group, the Maastricht group, Harriet DeWitt's group in Chicago, who are like, they're probably the 3 main microdosing groups actually doing good quality clinical trials. And I don't know if it's by chance or by design, but all of them, these 3 groups are all focusing on LSD microdosing. And that might just be a chance thing, right? And then the other kind of stuff that there's no actually good psilocybin clinical trial, microdosing clinical trials using like GMP certified products where people aren't just self-sourcing shit, right. There's like, sorry for the language. So there's no actually there's no good high quality psilocybin microdosing trials. The trials that are out in the literature is mostly like people self-sourcing stuff with these kind of wonky designs to get around like some of the regulatory issues that I've already described. So the quality of those studies just isn't as good as what, not to be immodest, what we have done, but also what the Maastricht group done and what Harriet DeWitt's group have done. So the quality of the psilocybin research is just kind of by chance or whatever, it's just not as good.
That's fair. I think we've heard a lot of that as well as we discuss these studies. Could you speak to a little bit of the safety? I think this is something that we've actually spoken about, Suresh, before. There's a lot of people that, that express concern because we don't know what microdosing does like long-term to our bodies. What do we know? What do we not know? If you could also compare maybe safety profiles between psilocybin and LSD.
Yeah, this is something I feel have been going increasingly kind of firm on as time has gone on. And now we've had several hundred participants through our trials. We've done enormous amounts of blood work and adverse event marking. And what I would say is that, from the data we have, probably 3 to 4 months of microdosing LSD is perfectly safe for most people, apart from maybe some contraindications like schizophrenia or whatever that we haven't actually studied. But for generally healthy people, like if they're generally physically healthy and, don't have particular contraindications, microdosing for them is very safe. We don't know if it's, from a clinical point of view, effective, but what we do know for sure is that it's pretty darn safe. And I would say the safety profile of LSD microdosing is far superior to what you get with antidepressants. Like the side effect profile is just far better. It's far better. There is this residual concern that people have about, and you've probably discussed it before with the heart and the cardiac valve thing. But my view on that is that it's mostly nonsense. And there's no real reason to think that this would be the case. And I'll talk for a bit on this. And there's multiple reasons why I think this is the case. The first is the exposure profile. So as a bit of background, serotonin 2B binding drugs have been found in the past to cause what's called a valvulopathy. And this essentially thickening of the valve leaflets in the heart. This was discovered in a weight loss drug in the 2000s, 1990s called fenfluramine, and there's other drugs like erbergoline and stuff that have shown to have these leaflet thickening effects, and that's obviously concerning. Now, because LSD and psilocybin also activate the 2B receptor, there's concerns that maybe that they could have the same effect. But the problem is these other drugs are given under a constant regime, right, where you're trying to maintain the level of fenfluramine in the blood constantly for months, years on end. It's not what you're doing in microdosing, right? You're like, essentially your exposure profile is like 6 hours every third day, right? So there's not that much exposure. So that's the first thing that's not consistent with that. There's been an animal study now which has shown that there's actually no valve thickening. I'm not sure if it's published yet. There's been an abstract, so it is out in the world.
I did see that as well.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah. And then we actually did about 16 patients. We did echocardiography in our LSD-1 study, pre and post. We didn't see anything. And the thing that really sells it to me is that, like, you know what? People have been using LSD for 50 years, and we have never seen any trace in the epidemiology that this is the case. And there have been people who have taken hundreds, thousands of LSD doses out there. Real troopers, right? That have taken vast amounts of LSD, and there's never been an epidemiological signal through it. And that just strikes me as being incredulous to think that if people are doing all this macrodosing, there's no signal in the epidemiology literature that microdosing is going to do the same thing. Like, it just strikes me as entirely improbable. What I think it is, there's a bit of a movement of people who don't like microdosing because they think everyone should be macrodosing, and so they project their own biases against it. But I just think it's just ridiculous. And I'll stand to be corrected by data, but from a Bayesian point of view of what's probable, I just think it's improbable. So,
Thank you for outlining all of that. I think it's important. It's definitely a question that's on a lot of people's minds. There's a lot of different narratives and stories and different people calling out different safety issues. So that's very, very helpful. Before we move on to some of the women's health topics and discussing that research, I'd love to talk about dependence and tolerance. And so different microdosing protocols, and what are you seeing in your research when it comes to your tolerance around dosing?
I'm going to take this one, and then Rachel can do all the women's health stuff. Because that's
and I'm curious about the dependence as well. That's a good one, Steph. Like, do people have any sort of
Yeah, because I did a little lit review, the other day, and I was reading, and there was some conflicting, evidence where the all in all summary of the lit review was just like, maybe there can be some dependence, maybe not. We don't know. And so I'm curious. Yeah. Does the dopaminergic activity play into that?
Yeah. So let's address tolerance first. So that tolerance is the idea that basically you need more dose as you go through, a particular thing. And obviously with lots of recreational drugs, there's tolerance effects. We don't see any evidence for tolerance in our microdosing regimes when people are microdosing every third day or a couple of times a week. We don't see any evidence. Now, it's interesting that for psychedelics, actually, when you dive into the literature, tolerance hasn't actually been studied since 1956 with Isbell's studies that were funded by the CIA, as it turns out. But so it's actually been 50 years since actually tolerance has actually been formally studied in laboratory settings to psychedelics. We're actually doing that at the moment. Rachel can tell you more about that. So we don't know too much about tolerance, but we don't see any tolerance effects. And then in terms of dependence, there's no physical dependence associated with LSD or psilocybin. So in terms of physical dependence, we don't see really. So we actually, after our regimes, we did withdrawal questionnaires a month afterwards to actually formally look for withdrawal effects, which would indicate dependence. And we don't see any kind of significant dependence, which would indicate, we don't see any withdrawal effects, which would be what you would kind of think if there was some kind of dependence. Now, whether people could sort of get, my cat, sorry. Give me a fright. Whether people could get maybe some sort of psychological addiction to it, right, where they feel that they need it, that we haven't seen any of that, but there is a possibility that one couldn't discount. So,
And before we move into the women's health, I have a question for Suresh or Rachael, and to answer that, to ask that question, I'm going to share my screen real quick. This is a graphic that was published, I believe, with some of the research that came out. Can you see my screen? Just to confirm.
Can you go full screen?
Yeah. Yeah, that's ours. Yeah.
Yep.
You see this, right? And it says baseline, the depression severity with the MADRS score. After 2 weeks, we see a pretty substantial drop. After 4 weeks, we see another reasonably substantial drop. And then from 4 to 6 weeks, there's essentially no shift or change whatsoever. And then 8 weeks, it goes down a little bit. 1 month, it goes down a little bit. And then 3 months, it sort of kilters off. So I'm just kind of curious to hear your speculation more than anything about why is it that we're seeing such a substantial drop from the baseline to 4 weeks, but really no shift and change from 4 to 6 weeks, those last couple of weeks. And the reason I'm asking this is because, a lot of people know that microdosing, it seems to be the benefits are cumulative, meaning what I often tell folks is if you're microdosing, really commit to a full 4 weeks or 6 weeks of doing this rather than sort of going off the substance too early. Kind of like you would with meditation, you're not expecting to be, less reactive after just 1 day of sitting on the cushion. It really takes the consistent practice of meditating 30 days in a row. So any sort of speculative thoughts to share about why are we seeing such a substantial drop from 0 to 4 weeks, but really nothing from 4 to 6 weeks and very little even onwards?
Are you going to do that, Suresh, or do you want me to do that?
I guess I'll do that. In that graph you saw that dashed line at 10.
Yeah,
that's what's called the remission line, and so actually, you've kind of almost maxed out what people are going to kind of realistically going to get to anyway. So it's kind of people have got the major depressive disorder. Often when on all sorts of types of therapies, all sorts of therapy, right? They never end up at 0. Probably most of us have a MADRS score of a 2 or 3 anyway, right? Life's not perfect. So so there is a kind of floor effect that we're probably seeing in terms of how much better people can get with that disorder. And that you see that across all sorts of.
Well, I've also heard this in some of the anecdotal kind of shares as I've just talked to a lot of people where they're people who aren't necessarily clinically depressed, but maybe they experience depression here and there. They notice that when they microdose when they're normal, they feel it, they notice it, it's helpful. But when they microdose when they're feeling a little low, a little depressed, they're like, oh, wow, I really notice the help that this can be, right? So I think there might also be that experience where when someone's really in the gutters, they're going to notice when they microdose, oh, wow, this is really helpful, versus if someone's already pretty good, the actual incremental shift or change is not that great necessarily for microdosing.
Yeah.
And the other thing to think about with the MADRS is that it is a depression rating scale where the higher your level is, the higher your experiences of depression are. There is no there's no part of it where it talks about positive add-on effects. So, there's no space for, to reporting actually improvement or better than usual sleep or connection or motivation. And so there's also a space at which the score might be changing on a different scale, but the MADRS doesn't have any room to go.
Got it.
So similarly, we see research and we hear a lot of anecdotal reporting around attention and attention deficit disorders. What are your thoughts? We're talking about mood and depression here, but I think I even saw a study come out where it said that LSD had no clinical value for ADHD, and it was very criticized after that. Where do you stand with that?
So my first thought was sort of it depends on the pathophysiology and the experience of an inability to concentrate and all those sorts of things. And perhaps I'm going to come back to the concept of the scale, right? Because people microdose and they say that it might help them focus on tasks or these sorts of things more. But first of all, it seems to depend what the task is. But it might not be the symptomology of ADHD that is changing, because this was ultimately an ADHD symptomology study where And so we know that the way that psychedelics can change people's experiences of things don't always fit in scales that were developed around the classic sort of treatment. It's something we experience in the depression literature. And I guess I would also say that I was a little bit surprised. I sit outside of the grey literature a lot of the time, so the Reddit posts, and I don't follow a lot of the psychedelics pop science or that kind of thing. So for me, I was like, well, why would you expect microdosing to work for ADHD? Yes, there is some talk about serotonin and ADHD, but if you look at the treatments, they're all, dopaminergic, and like they're working on different mechanistic classes based on what we know of the neurobiology of the disorder. There is a role of serotonin, but for me, it seemed like more of an out of the blue indication than some of the others. And so on that basis, I thought, well, yeah, psychedelics maybe could support people's experiences of ADHD. But that's not the same as saying that it would reduce the symptomology of the accepted diagnosis criteria for ADHD. And that's what that study failed to show. So I guess what I'm saying is it's probably not, it's not going to be an evidence-based treatment that replaces the stimulants from the way that we test the diagnosis and test the changing of symptoms. But that is not to say that people's experiences out in the wild of using it to help them achieve certain things aren't real. It's just sort of it's a different goal. It's a different outcome. It's more of a crutch than a fix. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Would you say that the dopaminergic activity of LSD would improve someone's focus and attention? That's a question that I get all the time. So yeah, wondering, since you guys are...
It's a hypothesis, and people kind of report that, right? That, that they can have, if they can get that right dose, that it can do. So the study that you're referring to is the Mueller paper, and JAMA from the Swiss LSD group. And, they didn't show effect. It was a pretty well-conducted study. But there are deficiencies, right? Because they don't use, and they admit this as well, they don't use dose titration, for example, like we do. So that could be an explanatory factor, that people aren't quite at the right level. I think they used a fixed 20 microgram dose. And then also they don't have the home administration and all that sort of thing. So it may be that, it doesn't capture what people are doing out in the wild, potentially. But it could also be that it was just, that's the way it is, So, but, it was, for what it was, the internal validity of that study was pretty good.
Yes.
Whether it applies to all situations is a different question.
Yeah, there are many ways to look at these studies. I think a lot of people, when they see the headline that they don't want to see, they're immediately trying to pick it apart. But there are different, things that a study might try to accomplish, and so I think it's important to look at it.
Yeah, so you can, the way to think about it is you can critique a study from whether, in terms of its internal validity and its external validity. So its internal validity was it well done? Was that a well executed trial?
Yeah.
And that study was a well-executed trial for what it is. So what it aimed to do, it was a well-executed study. The question is whether it has external validity. Does it apply outside to the other scenarios that people are microdosing under, and there may be that you can't make inferences about externally to other situations. And because it's a very tightly controlled study, it may not have external validity to these other situations that people are doing in everyday life. So...
Thank you. Are we ready to jump to women's health? Yes. Okay. Well, my first question is, I guess, could you, explain your interest in exploring LSD in relation to women's health specifically, and then what are you studying and why?
So, I think in some ways that's where the comparison point maybe with that ADHD study being something where it could have worked, but mechanistically there might not have been the match that I see in women's health as a great example of that. So I come from a space where my PhD research was how the menstrual cycle affects the brain and how we can image that. And it was just extraordinary, honestly, the scale of results that we saw with the EEG. So that inspired me to go down the path of studying the menstrual cycle and menstrual cycle related disorders, like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, menstrual migraine, exacerbation of epilepsy due to the menstrual cycle, these sorts of things. And you find this wide open space. You go, wait a second, how often am I thinking what mechanism could be driving this? And then there's just like this wide open space of the literature that doesn't exist on showing that. So I see this massive potential. And I like to apply my skills to where I can be useful. And if I'm interested, then that's great. And that's what puts me here. And so the same thing happened as I was involved in the psychedelics research, and I'm getting interested in premenstrual dysphoric disorder because I'd started to work with a group in Sweden who are probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, premenstrual dysphoric disorder research group. And I'm going down this path of estrogen and what is estrogen doing to the mood, and progesterone and what is progesterone doing to mood, and how can these fluctuations be causing this devastating change in mood where the person is fine during their follicular phase, and then it's like some kind of sabotage. Either when the second ovulation starts, they have a curtain descend, or it's like a gradual descent into often really irritability, risky suicidal thoughts, complete lack of motivation. They become a different person. People experience it quite differently. And the thing that came up from a mechanism point of view was serotonin. So I'm talking about that match between psychedelics and serotonin, and what's bringing me to what we're doing now is that there's been some positron emission tomography or PET scanning studies that have shown changes in receptor density, changes in serotonin transporter that lead to this dysfunctioning, this underfunctioning of the serotonin system in folk with PMDD. And there's all these sort of satellite studies around it that indicate that the serotonin dysfunction is probably really important for the shift in mood. So psychedelics are serotonergic, and there's a fair bit of overlap in how they're going to modulate the serotonin system and how the dysfunction is occurring in PMDD. So that got me interested and a little bit excited because SSRIs, they work really well for PMDD, and they actually work in a way that is more like they should work for depression. They work on the same day or the next day. They work so fast that it's almost like taking a Panadol for pain. And that's because SSRIs increase serotonin almost immediately. Within hours of taking that first dose, and you're correcting a serotonin issue, and there's a serotonin issue with PMDD, and so you're correcting the PMDD, and you think, this is really exciting. This is a really good match between the pharmacology of this drug and the outcome. The problem with SSRIs, most people stop taking them, even if they're effective, because of the side effects. So what could you think of, that might have a better side effect burden and an improved effect on serotonin? Psychedelics. So the match actually was like born out of the pathophysiology of the disorder and knowledge of the pharmacology of the drug. And that's where I think there's a really good match. And I would probably say the same there's some safety concerns and things to think about. Similar thinking around like postnatal depression and these sorts of things, as you're talking about things that have like this pharmacological match, and a massive issue with the current treatments that we have available. Microdosing is also a flexible dosing profile. It's already built into something where you stop and start it instead of doing it every day. So yeah, there's a match. And at the moment, we're back at the very beginning. We've been struggling to get this funded, and I found that a little bit shocking, this PMDD research. So we're not studying PMDD and psychedelics in a clinical trial context yet. We've been asking women what they've been doing and how it's worked for them in the same way that we did with those early studies to see what maybe we should do in a clinical trial. So we're gathering information. And we also have folk coming into the study at various points of their menstrual cycle, and we're giving them a moderate dose of psilocybin. And I'm doing a lot of blood sampling, a lot of EEG, and we're trying to look for evidence of the changes that we expect to sort of wrap around the support for this idea for dosing.
Maybe slow down and tell them about Simon specifically.
Yeah. That sort of it all comes out of my brain like a Board of so Simon is sort of what we're working on at the moment before we move into a clinical trial for a treatment for PMDD, for psychedelics for PMDD. Because there's one thing that hasn't been studied yet that Suresh talked about, it's tolerance. And whether if you were to take something every day, you would tolerate. And that's going to be important for PMDD because you have a high density time of the month that people are going to microdose for. The other thing is a change in response to the drug at different points of the menstrual cycle. We had a little bit of a chat before this, and there was already some anecdotal chat, and I've heard it as well, that people respond differently to psychedelics depending where in their menstrual cycle they're taking it. But there's no scientific study of this, but there's a really good rationale for it.
Could you explain a little bit why that would be, why different phases, depending on where hormones are at, would influence the psychedelic experience?
Exactly, yes. So I talked about how estrogen changes serotonin receptor density and transporters. Now in the menstrual cycle, the two main phases are split by either very low hormones or very high levels. And estrogen and progesterone go up really high in the 2 weeks before the period starts, which is day one of the next cycle. So ovulation happens, estrogen goes up, progesterone then follows it, and they sit nice and high. Over that sort of, I'd say about 5 or 6 days, they're both sitting really high. And in PMDD, the high level of estrogen seems to be the thing that potentially does the damage, because that's when you get those changes in serotonin receptors, and you're getting a serotonin dysfunction. So you might expect that somebody with PMDD, especially, would they be less sensitive and need a higher dose? Suresh, which way is that going to go?
Well, we can guess, but we don't really know. So
we don't really know, but we do know that we're expecting it to be different, because you've got a difference in the transporters that are about, and you've got a difference in the receptor densities that are about. We've got a rationale for a change in the serotonin system that should change the way that people respond to the drug. And I was going
to say, my guess, and it's a pure guess, is that during ovulation, you might get the strongest response to psychedelics due to estrogen bumping up the 2A receptor density. That's just a guess.
So my guess is actually that it'll be in the mid-luteal phase, because it'll be after 5 days of exposure. And I think that, because that's what happens in the GABA system, which is a whole different, I could go on for another hour on the other system, but progesterone interacts with a different system, and it's the GABA system. That's been very well studied, and we know that after 5 days of exposure, that timeline is really important, and I wonder if that's going to be the case with estrogen. So we might not see as much in ovulation, but we might see the beginning of something that's going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on. And actually, this is what we see with people's mood, is it's getting worse and worse and worse the closer they're getting to their period. And the relief occurs once their period starts, and that's when their hormones have dropped down to the bottom again. So yeah, what that looks like in terms of people's response and how they feel, we're not sure yet. But we've got EEG caps going on their head. We've got cannulas going into their arm, and we're going to be taking blood samples. And so we are primed to find out. And of course, we'll be asking them how they feel. But I like my objective stuff.
I would just jump in and say, this is the first study of psychedelics in the first proper clinical study of psychedelics in the menstrual cycle.
Congratulations.
So, and it's underway.
It's underway.
We can't wait. Just like in real life, there's so much trial and error. Clearly, there's trial and error in the scientific method as well.
Yeah, we can't pretend to know everything that's going to happen. We go in with something that's the best design that we can think of, and that is going to be safe.
Yeah. And the important thing here is that you've identified a gap, and I think that the medical and research community is also onto this gap, which is that a lot of conventional therapies aren't cutting it for women. That women have been studied like a version of men when we have a different biochemistry, and the fluctuating hormones that we experience throughout our entire lives is actually an opportunity for more study and for better treatment. Yes. So that's really exciting. Thank you for that overview. We are going to transition to questions. But first, I just want to make a quick little call out to the Microdosing Collective. As many of you on the call might know or might not know, we're the first 501c3 nonprofit in the US advocating for microdosing research, education, and policy change. We have a big growing community. We're also in support of many policy and legalization efforts for psychedelics across the US, and we're currently supporting a bill in New York that includes a personal use license. So that's really, really exciting. And to support that, fundraising is the name of the game, just like it is for research. So we'll be dropping a link, donation link here in the chat for you guys to check out, and we appreciate your support. And as Suresh and Rachael mentioned, they are also fundraising for their research. And if anything comes to your mind, any connections to make, feel free to reach out to us and we'll happily connect those dots for them. All right, let's go to questions. Let's see where we begin over here. Oh, well, there's a lot of them. Okay, if we don't get to all of your questions, do not worry. You can always email us and we'll do our best to answer.
Let's talk a little bit, because this will encapsulate a few of the questions, right? Sure. We talked a little bit about the efficacy for depression. What are just some other general benefits that you found in some of the research on LSD microdosing that might not be for a specific indication, but relate to energy, mood, maybe pain management or pain tolerance? Kind of give us a little bit of context there as well.
I think the big one that strikes me is really that kind of pro-social connectivity thing. That's what we really see a lot of. Like a lot of people, like
extroversion in a way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know about extroversion, but like just feeling kind of social and connected to other people. Like, and we see that in the healthy patients and the healthy participants and the patient volunteers. So they all seem to report this kind of pro-social connectivity with other people. So very often that'll be like, I really enjoy just playing with my kids and all this kind of stuff. Like real social connection seems to be something that comes out quite consistently, regardless of, mental health status or whatever. That seems to be something that strikes me as that we've seen a lot of. That isn't something that, and that's one that like people don't necessarily come into the studies with the expectation that would happen, but it does seem to happen. So, yeah.
And I just anecdotally, that's years ago when I started microdosing over a decade ago, I did it because I was done with alcohol. I didn't want to drink alcohol, but I still wanted to feel a little bit more socially connected when I would go out and hang out with people. And it's one of the biggest things that I've noticed with LSD microdosing in terms of just getting me on my shell a little bit more and being able to open up and connect with folks.
The other thing that I would say comes through with the patients, especially like the folk with PMDD or people just having difficulties with various things, was we asked people whether it helped with the physical symptoms of the PMDD, and they often said no. But it improved their resilience and coping or space to accept. So acceptance of yourself. And I think that's one of those things where the scales, again, that we use in these studies, they don't pick up on these. So when you don't see an effect, we didn't really measure it, but it's something that when you talk to people, psychedelics seem to give is space to accept yourself. And possibly some better space to find some coping strategies and to find some resilience, and that space can open up the opportunity for other things to come in and provide benefit. So even when it didn't help with pain, as an example, is it just improved people's ability to cope with that pain or to accept that pain as part of their journey. And actually that journey is a really important part of chronic pain.
Why is that?
Because essentially the brain sees it as threatening, pain is threatening, and then it becomes reactive, and then you just get into this really sensitized cycle where you kind of learn to expect pain, and then you get distressed about the pain. And I think if you look at the neurobiology of the pain circuit, it involves a lot of actually our complex cognition. So you have to address the complex cognition around pain because once you are accepting of it, actually your rating of that pain will go down massively because you're focusing on it less. Like, pain is a very complex thing. And so increasing your acceptance and coping can be a big part of reducing pain, even if it's not in an analgesic way or a pain relief kind of way. And that's where I can see some space for microdosing creeping in. But if you just ask somebody if their pain went down, they would probably say no, because it wasn't working as an anesthetic or an analgesic. It's quite interesting.
Huh. Interesting. Super interesting.
I think you touched on something like our perception of pain, the psycho-emotional relationship with pain, how pain becomes part of our identity. So psychedelics being these like mind, body, spirit medicines, the opportunity there is to reframe that relationship to the pain, how it affects our quality of life. I know that there is early research looking at perception of pain, anti-inflammatory effects, but to your point, it's not an analgesic. And in some cases, these are amplifiers, right, that can make us more sensitive. And so I think it's like, it's not taking the psychedelic as an analgesic like you would take Tylenol or Advil or an anti-inflammatory. It's more about working with the medicine so that it is working with your entire body, the mind, the body, the spirit, in a more integrative way. If you think about, syndromes like phantom limb, we're thinking about brain network disorders, right? This is not like a physical pain. It's a little bit different. Same for neuropathy and fibromyalgia. There is this mental health component. And so that's where we're seeing the possible success of psychedelic medicines and therapies.
And because it's interesting, actually, one person's story comes to mind where they had used a very effective, like, complete suppression and disconnection way of dealing with their pain. So they actually found microdosing intolerable for their pain because it made it something that they had to focus on. And so it didn't change their pain, but it unraveled their coping strategy. So it can go either way, but that does seem, that's a mechanism. That is a mechanism.
Right. Great. I think if there's anything else we didn't answer here.
I mean, a lot of these questions are about like suggested protocols for creativity or for ADHD, which I don't think Suresh or Rachel are going to be.
I think I have one comment to make, though, that we did learn from the PMDD research was that we went out there expecting to find some movement towards a consistent protocol that we would say, this is the protocol that worked. That it turns out everybody was doing either Fatimin or some version of it adapted to the menstrual cycle. We were going to go, we've learned what the folk are doing and we're going to trial this. I think naively that's what we went in thinking was going to come out. But it didn't. There were some consistent regimens that people were using, and it tended to depend more on where they got their information, but it also depended what their treatment goal was. So I think what's the most important thing is not necessarily to ask what the best protocol for depression or ADHD or, X disorder is at this point. Is what are you hoping to get out of it? Are you hoping to completely alleviate your symptoms and live without your symptoms? Because if so, you're probably going to have to use it in a way that's more like a standard prescription medicine, because you are asking for it to behave in the way that a standard prescription medicine would be, where it's consistently alleviating or removing something for you. But we had some people who were dosing for their PMDD when they were asymptomatic to help them build healthy resilience strategies that would mean that when they went into battle with their PMDD in their luteal phase, they had more in the tank. So like what do you want? And what fits in with your life, and then maybe find people that are reaching that treatment goal and see if there's some consistencies there. I'd say match your treatment goal to what you're thinking about doing, because there actually isn't evidence for a specific regimen for any of these things yet.
Yeah, the subjective experience is still very important in all of this.
Yeah. It really is.
Well, cool. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you both. Let's everyone in the audience can give a round of applause to
Thank you for joining us.
This has been fun. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We will have our next webinar. I believe it's November 20th. We're going to explore microdosing for autoimmune disorders. So make sure you sign up for our newsletter. If you haven't yet, you'll get a notification, an email about the upcoming webinar. So we'll see you next time. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,